In this video, I'll show you how to connect a FastAPI backend to a React frontend. We'll do this completely from scratch, so you'll get every single step, and I'll show you how to fix the common errors you're bound to run into, like a CORS error that I'm sure many of you have seen before. Now, near the end of the video, I'll even share with you a more advanced template that goes through all of the authorization and authentication. So if you do want an authenticated backend to have things like JWT tokens, users signing in, registering, etc., you can get all of that functionality from this video. So with that said, let's get into it and let's learn how to connect the FastAPI backend with the React frontend using Python and JavaScript. Now, in order to do this, of course, we're going to need to write some code, and to do that, I'd recommend using something like an IDE. Now, truthfully, you can use whatever you want, but for this project, I'm going to be working in PyCharm, which comes from the sponsor of this video, JetBrains. Now, the reason for that is PyCharm works well not only for building apps that use FastAPI or really any Python app, but it also works well with JavaScript and frameworks like React. Now, PyCharm also comes with some pretty game-changing features that make developing these types of apps significantly easier. Of course, PyCharm supports all major frameworks like Django, Flask, and FastAPI, but it also comes with pre-configured run and debug configs, which makes it fast and easy to start and test your apps. Not to mention support for Jinga and Django templates, advanced navigation, AI coding assistance, and built-in code snippets. As you'll see in this video, PyCharm also supports React, the front-end framework we'll be using. It has debuggers, deployment tools, and my favorite feature is the endpoints and HTTP client that lets you test your endpoints by sending requests right from the IDE without needing a third-party tool. You can get 3 months of PyCharm Professional for free by using the code TechWithTim at the link in the description. Now, let's dive in and let's connect FastAPI and React. So we're going to get started here, and I want to let you know that I do have a text-based guide that will show you how to do this that you can check out from the link in the description. It's just a part of the GitHub repository that contains all of the code for this video. So if you click in that GitHub repo and you go to notes.markdown, you'll see that it kind of has the guide with all of the code and what you need to put in the files. Obviously, the video is going to be more in depth, but just in case you need that, I do want to make you aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to hop into my IDE and I want to quickly explain to you what it is that we're actually going to do here. So in order to integrate FastAPI with React, what we need to do is create a React project, which will represent our front end, and then we need to create a FastAPI project, which will represent our backend. The front end is then going to send requests to the backend. The backend will handle any sensitive data, storing things in the database, authentication, authorization, all that kind of stuff, and then return results back to the front end. So what we're doing is we're isolating the project and we're having our user interface or our front end as a separate project just handled by React. And then we're having our backend or our API just handled by FastAPI. Now, this is best practice, and there is other ways where we can like render a React template using just FastAPI, but what we're going to have here is 2 separate components, and that means if we do eventually go to deploy this out, we're going to have a deployed backend and then a separately deployed front end. This is actually really nice because it means if the front end goes down, the backend doesn't necessarily go down, and we can actually create different types of user interfaces or applications for our project because the backend is isolated. So if we want a mobile app, we can use the same backend and we can have a different front end or a different library handling that. Anyways, I'm going to show you. We're going to start by setting up the backend project. Then we're going to set up the front end project, and I'm going to focus on how these two communicate and how you make it so you don't get things like a CORS error. Okay. So in PyCharm, what I'm going to do is press on new project, and I'm going to create a new FastAPI project by selecting on the left-hand side. Now, I know this might be different for some of you if you're not using this IDE, so don't worry, I will go through those steps in 1 second. Now, for the name, I'm just going to go with React. We're going to spell this correctly, ideally, and then FastAPI. Okay, and where it says interpreter type, I'm going to use a custom environment, which is a virtual environment, and we're going to talk about creating that in 1 sec. But what will happen here is PyCharm will actually automatically make one for me. So I'm going to press on create. Okay, it's going to bring us into the IDE here, and it is going to start me with a little bit of code. Don't freak out. You don't need to copy any of this code right now. It's just kind of a template, and I'll show you exactly what we need to do. I'm going to walk you through step by step, so don't worry. Anyways, I want to make this full screen, so I'm just going to go here. I'm going to go to view, appearance, and then enter full screen mode, just so it's a little bit larger for you. Okay, so don't worry about this code, this main.py and this test main HTTP. This is actually so you can test endpoints directly in PyCharm, but you'll see that we have this backend folder, and this is what I want to focus our attention to. So in the backend folder, you'll see that we have venv. Now, if you're working in PyCharm, you already have this. If you're not, you're going to need to create this. So within your main project, set up a backend directory, which I already have, but make a new directory, or new directory, make backend, so it looks like this. And then what we're going to do is open up our terminal. Okay, from our terminal, we're going to cd into that backend directory, and here we're going to create the Python virtual environment to isolate the dependencies for this project. So in order to make this environment, we're going to type python -m venv and then venv. Now, if you're on Mac or Linux, you can change this to Python 3. And what this is going to do is create a new virtual environment for you in this directory. Now, after we create the virtual environment, we need to activate the virtual environment. And this is a command you would need to run if you were kind of signing into a server, for example, or you were just coming back onto the computer after maybe you turned it off and turned it back on, to activate the environment before you can run the Python script. Okay, so the idea behind the virtual environment is we're putting all of the dependencies in here specifically for this project and isolating it from our other Python interpreters. So if we want to be able to run this project, we've got to activate the virtual environment so we're inside of there, and then we can run the code or install the dependencies. So there's two commands that you can use to activate the environment depending on what operating system you're on. If you are on Windows, it's going to be / the name of your environment, which will be venv if you followed along with me, /scripts /activate. Okay, this will activate the virtual environment, and you'll know that worked if you get this venv prefix appearing in your terminal. Because I'm in PyCharm, it already did it for me, but I'm just showing in case you're not. Okay, now if you're on Mac or Linux, you should be able to type source / the name of your virtual environment, so venv /bin, not scripts, and then activate. Same thing, when you run this, it should activate the virtual environment for you. Okay, so now that we've done that, what we're going to do in our backend folder is we're going to make a new file. Now this file we're going to call requirements.txt. This is standard in a Python project. In here, we're going to put all of the dependencies that we need for our FastAPI application. Now in my case, I just need FastAPI, I need UVcorn, and I need Pydantic. Okay. Now you might have additional dependencies. You might be using an authorization library. You might be using a bunch of other stuff. Whatever you're using, put inside of this file so that you've stored it and someone else using your project later knows what dependencies they need. Okay, then what we're going to do is install these dependencies. To do that, we're going to type pip install -r and then requirements.txt. Now, if this doesn't work, you can try the pip3 command, and what this will do is take all the stuff in your requirements file and install it in your now activated virtual environment. Okay, again, this is the best practice, and this is what you need to do on, for example, any new machine that you're running this code on. So if you later want to deploy this code and you want to run it on a server, for example, you need to make the new virtual environment, activate it, and then install the dependencies before you run your code. Okay, perfect. So we're in here, we've got this installed, and what we're going to do now is we're going to make a simple Python file. So we have this main.py file, but I don't want to start from something just in case you guys don't have that. So we're simply going to delete this, and inside of our backend folder, we're going to make a new file called main.py. Okay, in this file, we're going to write our simple FastAPI application, and I'm going to show you how we can handle the very commonly experienced CORS error, which is usually what trips people up when it comes to actually connecting their backend to their frontend. So we're going to start by importing UVcorn, okay? This is going to act as a web server to run our FastAPI app. Next, we're going to say from FastAPI, import FastAPI. Then we're going to say from FastAPI.middleware, we're going to import CORS, and you can see that I'm getting the autocomplete here, which is the CORS middleware. Okay, so make sure that's installed. Then I'm going to say from Pydantic, import the base model, and I'm going to say from typing, import list. Okay. So within FastAPI here, what we're going to do is initialize a new FastAPI project. We're going to define a few models. This is how FastAPI handles data validation. We're going to create a post and a get endpoint so you can see how that works. And we're going to allow our front end to access this backend. So we'll talk about that in 1 second. So we're going to start by defining our data models. If you've ever worked in FastAPI before, you know that one of the advantages of this is that what it can do is it can automatically validate data coming in, and it can format data going out based on pydantic models. So I'm going to say class fruit is a base model. I'm just giving you a very simple example here. You can make this anything that you want. And I'm going to say that this simply has the field name, which is equal to string. I'm then going to say class, and I'm going to say fruits, and this is going to be a base model, and all this is going to have is fruits equal to a list of fruit, okay? So all I'm doing is I'm going to set up a simple project that allows us to create a bunch of new fruits and to add those to a list. That's all we're doing, just so you can see how this works. Okay. Now that we've done that, we're going to create our FastAPI application. So we're going to say app is equal to FastAPI, and we're going to create a list of origins that are allowed. So we're going to say origins is equal to, and inside of a list here, we're going to define the endpoint or the URL of our front end server. Now, this is very important, and this is where you need to define any web application or really anything at all that you want to be able to access your application. So whether it's a server IP address, so maybe another API using this API, or whether it's your front end, in our case, like our React front end, that's what we need to define. So right now, we're going to define localhost port 3000, which is where we're going to run our React server in development. But later in production, if we changed to some endpoint, like techwithtim.net, for example, we would need to put this here. We need to define kind of the base URL or the base origin of anything that we want to be able to call one of the endpoints on our server. So now that we've done this, we need to enable and configure the CORS middleware. Now, CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing, and this is something that typically prohibits kind of unauthorized websites or endpoints or servers from accessing your API. The idea is we only want trusted sources, so our front end, for example, to be able to interact with our backend, so we need to give it access to that by defining the origin. Now, what CORS will do is it will block out any other requests that are coming from something that we're not aware of. So if someone's trying to hack your API, for example, and send unauthorized requests, it's going to block that. It's just not going to accept those requests from another server or from some other front end or whatever. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say app, okay, dot add middleware. Now inside of the middleware, I'm actually just going to use the autocomplete because this is giving me everything that I need. We're going to add the CORS middleware. Don't worry about the kind of yellow squiggly line. This is fine. That comes from this import right here. We're going to allow origins, and we're going to specify these origins right here. We're going to allow credentials, which means we can send things like JWT tokens, and we're going to allow all methods and all headers. Now, if you want to block, for example, a delete method or a put method or whatever, you can just specify the methods that you want and not include those. And if you wanted a specific header to not be allowed in any requests, you could block those here as well. Okay, so that is it for adding our CORS middleware. And now that we've done this, we'll be able to send a request from this URL to the backend, which we couldn't do previously. Okay, now what we're going to do is just set up a very simple in-memory database. This is a database that will not persist when the application shuts down, and I'm going to do this with a Python dictionary. I'm just going to say memorydb is equal to fruits, and this is going to store a list inside of the dictionary, and we're just going to add fruits into the list. The reason for this is just so we can set up a mock application. So from our front end, I can show you how we can call these different endpoints and actually interact with the backend. Okay, now we're going to say @app.get, and we're going to define the root endpoint, which is going to be /fruits, okay? Here, we're going to specify the response underscore model is going to be fruits, and this is a get endpoint that's simply going to return all of the fruits that we're storing in our database. So our app is very simple. We can create fruits, store them in the database, and then we can get a list of all of the fruits we've created. Okay, so we need to define a function now. So we're going to say get fruits, and we're going to return, and we're going to use this pydantic model here to take this fruits from our database and return it in a format that's consistent with FastAPI and with the API's endpoint that we're writing. I know that's not super clear, so I'll explain it in 1 second, but we're going to return fruits, and we're going to say fruits is equal to the memorydb at the key fruits. Okay, so what's happening is when we go to the /fruits endpoint, we are going to define that the response model that we want to return from this endpoint is fruits. Now, FastAPI will be able to look at this and automatically know how we should convert this Python object into JSON or JavaScript object notation that we can return from this API so that our front end can ingest it and read it. That's why we're defining the response model. Then we say, okay, the name of our function is getFruits. We can call this anything that we want. When we go to this endpoint, this function will be called, and we're going to return an instance of this fruits class. This will simply take our memory DB with our fruits, just kind of wrap it into this Python object, and then return it as nice JSON so our user or our front end can use it. Okay, now it actually already knows what I want to do next, which is kind of scary what's happening with AI here, but we're going to write it out ourselves. The next thing we're going to do is have a post endpoint. We're going to post to the fruits endpoint again. This time we're not going to return anything, so we don't need to have the response model. And we can say define add underscore fruit. We can take in a fruit, so we can say fruit is equal to fruit, and then we can say our memory underscore database at fruits, and then we can append the fruit. And actually I lied, sorry, we are going to return a fruit, so we'll just return fruit, and we will say that the response model this time is fruit rather than fruits. Okay. So what's going on here? We're saying, okay, we're going to have a post request here, which is typically what you use when you want to create new data. We're going to take in a fruit from the user. So we use this Pydantic model up here that we defined. FastAPI will automatically validate that we are passing a valid fruit, which in this case just simply has a name, but we could add anything else that we want to it. If it's correct, we're going to add this into the database by appending it to the fruits list, and then we'll return that fruit just so the user knows which one they added. Okay. That's really our entire API. So what we can do now is we can run the API and we can test it out and make sure it's working. And to do that, we're going to write the following lines. We're going to say if underscore underscore name is equal to underscore underscore main. And again, scary how well it knows exactly what I want to do here. I'm going to say uvicorn.run app. I'm going to specify my host, which is going to be equal to 0.0.0.0, which just means run on all active IP addresses. And I'm going to specify the port of 8000, which is default for FastAPI. So this line is important because this will actually run the application for us. And now what we can do is we can just run this. So we can use kind of all of the PyCharm tools to run this app and all the configurations and stuff, or we can just run it from the terminal, which is what I'm going to do to make sure all of you are able to follow along. Okay, so I'm going to open up my terminal here. And now that we've written all of this code, I'm going to type Python main.py in my activated virtual environment. And we're going to start running our API on port 8000. Okay, amazing. So now the API is running. And if we want to test this, we can send curl requests, we can use Postman, and we can test this without having the front end if we want to do that. And a simple way to do this is just to go in our web browser to localhost, okay, port 8000, and type /fruits. When we do this, we should see that we get fruits, and then we get this list. And the reason why this is working is because we are sending this request from the same server in which this API is running, so there's no issues, and we're not running some other server or on some other port or something like that. Anyways, you can see that I get fruits, which is an empty list. And now if I want to send a post request, that would actually require that I write a custom curl command, which is some way that you can send requests from the terminal. But since we're working in PyCharm, we can test this using their HTTP tab. Now for testing the post endpoint here in PyCharm, I have a few different options that make this really easy. So I can click on this button right here and go to show all endpoints of application. If I do that, it shows me the different endpoints here. I can kind of click through it. That's useful. But what I actually want to do is I want to generate kind of a test for this endpoint and run it directly in PyCharm. So if I click here instead, I can generate a request in HTTP client. So I'm going to do that. Okay, you can see that it kind of generates this endpoint for me, but notice that it doesn't have the body. So if I want to have the body, which I need to send that contains, for example, the name of the fruit, we can get rid of this and we can go to plus and we can make a post request with parameters body or with a text body, up to you. So I'm going to go with text body because that's what we need. And I just need to change this to be port 8000. I need to change this to be fruits because that's the endpoint we want to hit. It already has the header that we need here. And then directly inside of this, I can just specify the fruit that I want to create. So I can say something like name is a pear if I want to make a pear. Okay, now because my API is running, I can just press on run and you'll see that it sends the HTTP request. We get the response, it actually saves it in a file in case we want to look at that. And I can close this, I can go back to my terminal and notice that we got okay when we sent this request. Now, if we want to send another request, we can do that. So we can just say, okay, let's make a new GET request. And where do I want this to be? It's putting it at the top, okay? So I'm gonna go 8000/fruits fruits. And then I want to run this one. So I'm just going to click on run. And you can see that now we get our fruit which has the name story of pear. Okay, so I know that this doesn't work for you if you're not running in PyCharm, but I'm just kind of quickly showing you these features because I think they're pretty cool. And they do allow us to test the API before we write the front end. So at this point in time, we have the API. It's working, we've tested the endpoints, and now what we're gonna do is write the front end that can communicate with this API. So we can leave it running if we want, there's no reason to shut it down, and what we're gonna do is make a new directory now. So I'm gonna make a new terminal instance here, I'll just leave this running, and make sure this is inside the root of your project, so not the backend folder, but React FastAPI, and we'll create a new Vite React project. So to do that, we're gonna write the following command. We're gonna type npm create Vite at latest, and then this is going to be called frontend because that's the name of my directory, and I'm going to go -- template and then React. Now make sure you have Node.js installed for this command to work. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and press enter here. I'm just going to select that I want React, and I'm just going to go with JavaScript. I don't need anything else. Okay, so now it has created this directory for me, so I'm going to cd into that directory, so cd frontend. I'm going to type npm install to install all of the packages, and I'm going to install an additional package called Axios, which is going to make sending requests to our API significantly easier. Okay, so now I'm going to type npm install Axios to make sure that I have this. This allows us to send requests significantly easier, and we're going to start setting up our project. So all of the code that I'm about to show you here is available from the link in the description. This is not meant to be a React tutorial, so I'm not going to write it all from scratch, but I will go through the important components so you really understand how this works. So what we need to do is we need to go inside of SRC here. Inside of SRC, we want to make the directory kind of look as the following. We want to have a new directory called components, where we're going to put some important components, for example, adding the fruit, viewing the different fruits that we have. We have our app.jsx, we have our main.jsx, and we're going to make a new file called api.js, which is where we're going to put the Axios definition for calling our API. So I want to start with that because that's probably the most important thing. So I'm just going to copy this in here. So I'm going to say import Axios from Axios. I'm going to say axios.create. Okay, I'm going to call this an API. And I'm going to define my base URL as the URL of my backend. Okay, so in this case, the FastAPI backend is running on localhost port 8000. If it was running on a remote server, you would change it to whatever that server IP address is. Now, what we're going to do is rather than using normal Axios to send requests, we're going to use this API variable. And rather than having to write out the base URL every single time, we can just write the endpoint that we want to call. So later on, if we want to change this endpoint, for example, we don't need to change it in 100 places. We can just change it here, and then the entire app will go to use a different backend. This is best practice and what I'm kind of setting up here. Okay. So now that we have api.js, what we're going to do is add our two components. So inside of components, I'm going to say new, and I'm going to make a new file called add.fruit.jsx. Okay, now I'm just going to copy in the code here, and all of this again is available from the GitHub. So I come here, I show you, I'm just copying it right from the GitHub where I have it in the README file. So fruits, add fruit form, etc. Okay. So you can see we have the add fruit form. In the add fruit form, what we're doing is we have a simple form. It has the name of the fruit, and we have a button that we can press to submit. And when we do that, what we're doing is calling this function that we pass as one of the props to this component. And this is where we're going to actually handle the network request to send to our API to create the new fruit. We're going to look at that in 1 second. Okay, now we're going to make another new component, and this is just going to be fruits.jsx. Okay, so I've pasted this in here, and I'm just going to run you through the important parts of this code. Now notice that I've imported API from api.js, which is where we defined our Axios configuration, and I've imported the add fruit form from the component we just made. Now inside of here, we have two functions that send network requests, one add fruit and one fetch fruits. Now fetch fruits is what's getting the fruits by sending a get request, and notice that all we had to do this was say api.get, and then we've got the /fruits endpoint. Now this is going to use this Axios configuration that we defined. It's going to use this as the base URL and simply send a request to /fruits. Since we've now set up the CORS origin, it means we're not going to get an error here, and we can grab all of the fruits from our API and display them on our front end. This is how you send the get request. Then we have a post request. So here what I've done is I've created an add fruit function, which I pass to my add fruit form. So it gets called when we add a new fruit. And notice that all we're doing here is we're posting to /fruits. Okay, and we're just specifying the name of the fruit that we want to add. Now I know that this is basic, but I'm just trying to show you two examples, right? Getting and posting. Okay, now that we've done this, what we're gonna do is go to app.jsx, and we're just gonna copy in that component, which looks like this. All we're doing is we just have a little bit of a header here, and then we're just rendering this fruit list. That's it, okay? So very, very simple kind of front end here with React. So now kind of the moment of truth. We've got our front end, we wrote our API.js, we can send the request now to our backend, and what we're gonna do is just run the front end. So to run the front end, we're just gonna type npm run dev here. Now, when we do this, it's going to spin up a server on port 5173. So just as a sanity check, we can go to our backend, we can look in main.py, and we can make sure that we're allowing the origin of, oh, look, we were allowing 3000, but it should be 5173. So whatever port your front end is running on, you want to change it to that. However, let's see what happens if we leave it on 3000 and try to send this request. Okay, so if I go here, I've opened up my front end, I'm on port 5173. I can go to inspect and console and notice that I'm getting this issue. It says access to HTML request, localhost port 8000 /fruits is blocked from this origin. We cannot access it because of CORS policy. So that's what I'm talking about. This is the issue that most people run into. So the way that we fix that is we change this to be the correct URL. So 5173, we save and we make sure that our server reloads here. So we can just close it down and rerun it. Okay. And now if we go here, and we save, let's go into the console again. So inspect, let's make this bigger, console. Notice we're no longer getting that CORS error. And to really make sure this works, we can add the fruit, for example, pear, and you see it gets added here. We can go with, what do we want? Apple, and you see that it gets added here, no problem. And you can see that the post and the get to these endpoints are happening successfully. There you go. That's how you connect a front end and a back end using FastAPI and React. Okay. Now I'm not done yet. I'm gonna give you guys more value as I always do, and I'm gonna share with you a template that explains how to do this a lot more complex when you're dealing with authorization and authentication. Now I'm just gonna do this on GitHub because I don't wanna spend a massive amount of time here, but you'll notice that if you look at the code on GitHub, we have this simple folder, which contains all the stuff that I just showed you how to make previously, and we have this auth folder. Now in the auth folder, we have the same stuff. We have a front end and we have a back end, but I've set up a sample project that uses user authentication. So it allows you to, for example, have a persistent database to hash users' passwords, to sign in, to sign out, to store data in the database persistently. Now, I'm not going to run the project, but I will quickly kind of show you some of the main files and you can have a look at it in case you want to see a more advanced example. So for example, in our backend, we have this authentication folder. In here, I set up all of the stuff that we need. I know it looks like a lot of code for handling user authentication in FastAPI with something known as JWT tokens. If that means nothing to you, don't worry. Okay, next we have our, let's go into database.py. This is all of the stuff for initializing the database and giving you a reference to it so you can use it later on. We have models.py. This is how we specify all of the models. In this case, we have a user model that we're storing in our database. We have a schemas.py. This is defining all of the kind of pedantic models that we need for our FastAPI data validation. We of course have requirements.txt, which has some additional requirements. And then we have our routes or our routers. Now we have an authentication router, which handles registering and grabbing the user token, which is doing that for authentication. So for signing in essentially. And then we have user.py, which allows you to get information about yourself, but only if you are authenticated. So I don't want to go through all of it, but if you read through the backend, you'll kind of see how this works. It's a really solid template for handling user registration and authentication and protecting routes. In this case, we protect the root by making sure that we have a current active user before we allow someone to activate this or to run this, endpoint. Okay. So that's it for the backend. And then on the front end, it's pretty much the exact same thing. You'll see that if I go to source, I have this api.js file. This is a bit more complex, but I've put in the different endpoints, like what we need to do to log in a user, to register a user, to fetch the user profile. And then we use that within the front end that I set up, which you can run if you want, to kind of, sample the application in terms of signing in, logging in, registering, etc. Okay. So that is it, guys. I know that was a lot. I talked a lot. I showed you a lot of stuff, but I wanted to be as detailed as I can when it comes to connecting FastAPI to React. I know that there's a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. Obviously, your application is going to be different than what I wrote here, but I hope this was a decent guide to get you started and at least fix that main CORS issue that you've probably seen before and give you a bit of info about kind of how to set up the project completely from scratch. If you appreciate this, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.